Welcome to the Canadian Superbike Podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Canadian Superbike Podcast. Marshall Ferguson alongside Colin Fraser, who is back from Valencia. He was there with the MiniGP, all things MotoGP. He's been sending me pictures of every single human and their dog who might be wearing an HRC hoodie. I don't know who they are. Although I will say I did get a picture of Alberto Puig, who looked very angry that Colin was taking a picture of him. Colin, was that one of those interactions where you think you're being sneaky and you pull out the phone to tap, and then all of a sudden the head of HRC turns around and looks at you and is like, "It's this guy's dude. What the hell is going on?"
I don't know. I spoke to him briefly. I was shooting, and the way it works in Valencia is once you get to the infield, it's kind of a free-for-all, and you can be taking pictures, and someone random person just decides to start watching what's going on right beside you. And he pulled up on basically the same Honda scooter I have, only his was red, mine's silver. And I was admiring it, and I literally said, "Oh, I have the same scooter, but mine doesn't look that nice." And we chatted briefly, and then I got my phone out to take his picture, not the big camera I was holding, and that seemed to throw him. I don't know why, but yeah, he isn't looking as friendly in the image as he had been moments earlier.
Would you like to promote your Instagram? Is it posted on your Instagram page? Because I feel like that would be now is a great time for you to be able to put that out there so people can enjoy how angry the head of Honda Racing looks at you.
Well, I don't know if he's technically the head. He's one of the senior people, and he's Spanish, and he's been a linchpin of what's been going on there. And I actually sent you a picture of the guy who's the head of HRC, who was standing right beside me in my lineup for the plane. So I had all the junior test team young guys in front of me, waiting as I was for the zone 5 to 8 cheap seats, and the higher ranking people were to my right. So there were several HRC senior staffers and a bunch of KTM guys, and if I spoke Japanese, if my daughter were there to translate, I'm sure I would have some stupendous gossip from Honda, if anyone's interested in Honda gossip, but I don't speak Japanese. So.
Yeah, why don't you just bring your daughter everywhere with you when you go to these things, man? You would know everything from Yamaha and Honda. That'd be amazing. They wouldn't even know. They wouldn't expect anything.
Well, and the odd time my daughter's been there, she says one of the great things is because there aren't that many Japanese people out in the world culturally compared to other Asians, that Japanese people now who are famous for being very discreet and polite speak with impunity. They say all kinds of interesting things because they aren't worried anyone can understand what they're saying. And she says walking around Toronto, the conversation she overhears from Japanese people can be quite entertaining.
Amazing. Well, here's cheersing a green tea sip from the HRC mug. I'm literally drinking the Kool-Aid because see you later, Concession Group D. There you go.
Yeah, there was considerable discussion if moving up is going to make much difference and how that's going to look. And they chose, and I respect, to be excited about that and really, wind it up. And if Yamaha start making real headway next year because they have so much more opportunity to test and so much less restriction on what they test. But Honda have had maybe a quiet year, but I think a very good year. Yamaha, in my opinion, sucked most of the oxygen out of the Valencia test because they had a wall of motorcycles. They had inline fours, they had V4s, they had development bikes, and they had Toprak.
Yep.
And Toprak brought his own energy and his own oxygen, and definitely a lot of people from the World Superbike paddock, including journalists, were covering him. And I had that picture in the Inside Motorcycle site where people are just following him around, which was kind of funny because he was hard to find because he was dressed completely. He went to like a skateboard shop and bought regular clothes. And it's weird because he still wears Dainese leathers. He's still sponsored by Red Bull, but he wasn't ID'd in any way. Early on in the test, we were keeping track of he had fancy chocolates for his team, and he had baklava at one point, and we were watching him out on the track where he'd like run way wide to let people by, and he was definitely trying to act like not the Toprak we know from World Superbike.
Yeah, interesting. I'll get to more Toprak stuff in a second, but the first question I want to ask you here is, do you think Honda would have actively pressed, and I'm not saying that, whether it's like the classy tank that people talk about the Raptors doing last year or whatever you want to call it, but there are benefits to still being in concession class D. And so when you move 2C, you get some engine stuff taken away and you can't use your your MotoGP riders, right? It's just the test riders. So now it'll be Alessio Spargaro and Taka Nakagami doing most of the Honda testing stuff, and like there's a bunch of different stuff. Do you think Honda would have pushed to get into C were it not Yamaha that was also in D? Because unfortunately, the way that going into MotoGP in 2025, it was like Class D was the Japanese Cup. It was like this like little sub micro thing of like, well, I guess Honda won the Japanese Cup because they got out of Class D and Yamaha's still down there, despite the fact that we know that Yamaha's coming with a variety of great stuff moving forward.
Yeah, I don't think Honda likes being lumped in with Yamaha in that specific way. I think Honda have always felt somewhat superior, although the broad history of MotoGP and prior to that, Grand Prix Racing 500s, Premier Class, whatever you want to call it, has largely been Honda versus Yamaha. And I would argue that anytime Honda versus Yamaha isn't a story that predominates, it's probably a sign that the series isn't everything it can be. And at Valencia just 2 or 3 years ago, I seem to remember in the top 10 there was exactly one Japanese bike, and it was Marc Marquez on a Honda, and nobody thought that was representative of what the Japanese were up to at the time. And then you get into when you pick a star and you do all your R&D around that star, and with Yamaha it would be to some degree Quartararo, and definitely with Honda it was Marquez. You can get lost if it doesn't work. And you could argue that Ducati's problems at the moment partially stem from the fact that last year when the 2025 was being developed, Pecco was the only guy riding it. So the guy who ironically is having the most problems is the architect of that particular design, or at least the development. And we saw a little bit, and we're not going to know completely in Valencia exactly what was tested, but some things definitely were tested that the riders liked, but the teams didn't see the data correlate with what they thought it was going to be. And that's electronics changes and a lot of detaily stuff that only the engineers can see. And then you get the aero, and we're just guessing about how the aero works, and what the riders think about the turbulence and running with other bikes and all that kind of stuff. And we saw a lot of aero, which is interesting because we only have a year left on these aero rules. So I think the expectation was not much of that. And when they started opening the garage doors in the morning and pushing the bikes out to warm them up, we went, okay, they're going full in on new aero, particularly Ducati, interestingly.
Well, and Aprilia had that rear wing that I actually wanted to ask you about, because it was kind of this like big sloping loop thing. And the first thing that I thought when I saw it was like, that's just a spoiler. And it's not that that's a bad thing. It's that I wondered, and correct me with the terminology I'm supposed to use here, but in terms of what McLaren did earlier this year with Formula One, where it's like, we're not actually going to open DRS because we can't, but this thing's going to flex and move and have a lot of bend to it and do this and that and change the way that the car feels. Is that like the active aero, or is that the passive aero? What is that? Because to me, that was my first thought when I saw what Aprilia had on the back of Bez and Jorge Martin's bike. I was like, is that something that might have some flex to it where it can actually create some sort of downforce when they're not able to do ride height device or whole shot device?
Well, a lot of the F1 guys are reasonably specific about flex. And when you watch the onboards, you can see things move. And that's on purpose. And that is regulated. In MotoGP, they don't regulate the movement. So there's a lot more movement in the aero. And definitely the smarter than me people who aren't out taking the pictures but are analyzing the photos or the bikes on the video, they felt that hoop wing that we saw, and it was added to the Aprilia that had all the funny graphics on it that looked like a GM test car from 12 years ago.
Which looked really cool, and my son really liked it while we were watching the test on Tuesday because he was home sick from school so that he could watch the 6 hours of testing from Valencia. But as we were watching that, he was like, yeah, that's really cool. And I was like, I'm pretty sure that's so it's hard to figure out what aero is on the bike.
Yeah, it is very, very hard to figure out. And I can tell you, as the bike goes by at high speed, I can go back and look at the image I just took, but I can't blow it up on my computer screen when I'm standing in a field. So, the photographers would all look at each other and then look back at our screens and try and figure out, did we just see something interesting? And most of us spent the early part in the pit lane because we knew they wouldn't go out because the track was cold and it had rained a lot the night before. So you're playing this little game where you wait to go out until there's a fair bit of traffic when you're going to be able to get enough shots. It's useful. And we all went out, and then it was an hour and a half before anything happened. Yeah. So all that basically happened is we were cold and sunburned, which is a bizarre combination.
But how great was that Jack Miller outlap? How exciting was that when you heard an engine start up and you were probably, oh, you guys all get excited, and then he came puttering around and went right back into the pits.
Well, Maverick was out twice,
Yep.
just enough to say he was out. And again, I'm looking at my camera and going, well, he's on rain tires. What's
Yeah.
going on
So,
there?
and it seemed like from the Dorna broadcast that Maverick almost was sent out by somebody. I don't know if it was Red Bull, KTM, whatever. It almost seemed like somebody from the organization was like, "Hey, can someone volunteer to go do a couple of laps just so we actually can figure out what's going on there?" And I think it seemed like Red Bull KTM said, "Maverick, you want to do?" He's like, "Sure, I'll throw reins on. I'll just go out and do those, but never actually complete a lap," kind of thing. So that was interesting that he got sent around. But speaking of when we mentioned Jack Miller coming out and all the rest, I'll get to the Top Rack stuff. But how did the V4 sound? Like, what were your thoughts on the V4 craziness? Because it's been one of these, is it coming? When is it coming? Okay, it's going to come. Oh, it's coming with one guy. It's Augusto Fernandez. Okay, but it's not going to come with this guy. But we're going to get it at this track and then that guy. And then it's been this like months long saga. And finally, at the postseason test, it's like, nope, there's the V4. So you were there. What did you think?
Well, initially, of course, it was racing, and it's quite noticeable, not for sound, but for its appearance, because it had no livery; it was just blue.
Yep.
And when it was alone, you could hear it was slightly different, but not distinctly different. The way, for instance, the Aprilias sound. But then when there were a whole bunch of them out, which was in the afternoon once they got going, and I don't think too many people rode the inline other than Quadraro, who I think was sent to set a baseline time. And I think he eventually went just marginally quicker on the V4. And as usual for him, seemed to be making an effort not to praise it. Everybody else was making an effort. And of course, the bike, whatever the development situation was with the development bike that has been run on and off in the second half of the season, they were out of that loop, right? All the rules about testing and engines and restrictions are gone, and they had lots of bikes for everyone to ride. However, what was interesting for me is for Raz Gatlioglu, it's easy to forget he is physically significantly bigger than
Yeah.
MotoGP riders. And that means he can't just get on someone else's bike. It's not like you and I stop for coffee and you get on my street bike and I get on yours. Like these bikes are very much engineered. And his manager was talking about just him trying to get comfortable. So when he's riding different bikes and they're trying to switch tail sections and move the handlebars and just make it so he fits, to find that last little bit of time will partly come from him eventually sticking to the two bikes that are his and not trying everything. But the problem is Yamaha need him to participate in development. And of course, the only bike he's recently developed was a BMW.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit complicated. And, he did a good job with that BMW because if you check the points, there aren't very many of them at the front except for his. But having said that, I thought Raz Gatlioglu had a good test. I think there was a lot of excitement and interest based on him. And honestly, I thought the MotoGP paddock was a little more excited about him than they would be because they're a little bit superior. But it may be because he was the story. And of course, the cat's been away, the cat's been hurt. So the mice have definitely been playing. And the young guns are getting their attention, which is terrific. And you look at who was at the front, it was kind of similar to what we'd seen in terms of pace from the race 2 days previous. But I don't know. I mean, we really don't know what the Ducati's capable of, and the indicators seem very positive for the factory Ducatis, but they were a relatively low key bunch. And if Marc Marquez had been there, it would have been completely different. And of course, his brother finally is on an A bike, right? So there's a lot going on there. But some people were early on the curve of what they're trying to learn for next year. So when we get to Asia for the official tests, then there's going to be a lot of pressure to show that you actually have the pace to go with the bike you've been offered for next season.
Yeah, it's funny hearing you mention the like rider ergonomics with Top Rack as well, because I do think people forget that until you see him almost in like the practice start situations like they did at the end of the day, and you just realize that like Quadraro is amazing because he's crawling all over the front of the bike and he pins himself to the side and his weight is so like he's planted. And Top Rack is just so gangly and long and skinny and all the rest that he's obviously going to have to adapt to some of those things. But I did see they mentioned on the broadcast that Diego Moreira was um, that he had already obviously gone through like his setup and where he wanted things and he actually was after the first time he came from a run on track, he was actually sitting on the bike and still trying to figure out like, do I actually want this to be my setup? Right, because he's feeling everything out still for that LCR Honda team. So, yeah, interesting stuff. But let's talk Top Rack for a minute, just because you say that you think he had like a positive day. I'm fascinated by it because he brings this quirky energy that he's kind of always had in World Superbike. unique and different and feels kind of fun and fresh and all the rest. But when he gets into situations like what was it at the start of the year when he made the Ducati Cup comment? It's like he has this real switch that can get flipped, right? Where it goes from like, yeah, I'm top rack, this is fun and that. And there was a moment as well in the broadcast of him and Keenan Sofoglu standing there with Dennis Onshu, and they all had their arms crossed and they were standing staring at his bike, and everybody looked like they had just come back from the morgue. Like they were just so dead serious. But Toprak was that. And there was actually a moment as well where I believe Dovizioso was talking to him in his garage, and Toprak was looking up at the timing screens and like listening and trying to comprehend what Andre Dovizioso was saying, but he was just kind of going on. He was so locked in, but then he also gave the showman stuff of he kind of had a little bit of fun at the practice starts. He tried to do a little bit of a stoppie when he came in at the end of the day as everybody was waiting for him. He gave out, like you said, the different food items throughout the garage when he was there in the morning to try and get some goodwill. He was having some fun with Jack Miller at some point. So it's like he was kind of dancing the line and trying to do a little bit of everything in his public debut, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I think it worked.
Yeah.
I think we were all wondering, and it's funny because with Quadraro being the high-paid superstar at Yamaha, and so much rumor in Europe about what could happen with him, and he was so conspicuously not wearing any team gear. When I saw him talking about people who hang out at skateboard shops, that's how he was dressed. He didn't have anything on that said
I don't know if
Monster
there's a lot of
Yamaha.
skaters that wear pearls, though.
I like the pearls,
I do
but
too.
that's
I
that.
do too.
But the pearls are another source of controversy with him. Some people really don't like it, and I don't know. I mean, the rumors are so heavy that he's going to replace Pecco, and he would probably have to take less money to do that. And it's a shame what's going on with Bagnaia, but things are ugly there now.
Oh yeah.
And they unfortunately Ducati have a history of eventually playing hardball with guys who can't get pace out of the bike. And when Marquez gets back, that's just going to get heavier. And it is interesting that in all the talk about Razgatlioglu, that his arch rival actually has been racing MotoGP longer and not doing great, but not doing bad. And honestly, by Tuesday, starting to look like he belongs in that paddock and starting to act like he belongs in that paddock, which I thought was terrific.
He's a lock for Grassini in 27, is he not? In Nicola Bulliga?
I hope so.
Like that feels like I don't know. We're playing 2 years ahead, but the reality is like 26 is one of those dead, which is a dead year. I was going to ask you this as well. The whole inline for Yamaha when it's like inline 4000 cc, you got to be developing the V4 850. They're doing essentially 3-4 different bikes over the last 6 months, year, whatever. The whole premise of the change in regulations going into 27. You've experienced this in a variety of different series and eras and all of the rest when you go from this CC to that CC to these tires to those tires. What is 26 going to be? Because they were all doing this test and I'm getting all excited about it. And then you kind of got to reel it back in for a second and go, yeah, but if Marquez is healthy, he's just going to do what he just did. Like he might have an even higher point total depending on what happens with the Aprilias based on what we've seen.
I would be inclined to agree with you, and I think when you move the goalposts, and we see this more in F1 lately than we've seen it in MotoGP, we'd like to think it plays to the smaller teams, but I think it hugely plays towards the better teams because they have the most data. They know the most. Now, the wild card is the tire change, right?
Mm.
That is going to be interesting. And that Toprak is excited about riding in Pirelli after his first year. But having said that, honestly, I think his adaptation progress with the Michelin was a little bit more than we all expected and not as traumatic. Like he ran off a few times and he doesn't have that feel from the front. The Pirelli is a very pliable tire on the brakes. He's never going to have that feel. And that's always a problem with the Michelin. The people talk about that transition, but the indicators are that he can make that transition, and Bulliga has, it's hard to explain that paddock because there's so little time between the front and the back. And you look at where Trackhouse is right now, again in a world without Marquez, but we've had some people move toward the front. But what is the real pace? Like the lap times were quite good, both in the race and in the test. But what is going on right now in MotoGP? When you don't have Marc Marquez there, you don't actually know. But the last few races without Marc have been really, really interesting, and some young guys have got the attention they're due. And honestly, from talking to the Europeans' point of view, the thing that comes out is how sure everybody was that Pedro Acosta would have won a race by now. Yeah. And even after he had problems in the sprints on Sunday, everybody was saying, okay, this is the last race of the season. Acosta's got to get it. And it didn't go his way, right? He actually had some issues, and he's talking about he doesn't have a focus, and, he needs to think about points in the championship, and they're struggling with tire wear late in the race. But, the coronation of Acosta as the next big thing just hasn't quite happened.
I think hindsight's 2020, but the missed opportunity at Motegi last year feels so big now after that he hasn't won after these 2 seasons of being in MotoGP. But he was, by the way, I texted you and you told me that you were sitting in the media center and you read my text out loud, at which I blatantly accused, probably recklessly, because he was going to jump on a MotoGP motorcycle and go testing for the full day. Pedro seemed very hungover when they were not running in the morning, to the point where I was genuinely concerned because it went right off the rails with the interview that he did while they were standing on the pit wall. It was Jack Appleyard from the broadcast, and I believe Paul Trevathan was standing alongside of him as well. His crew chief was there, and Pedro's done a really good job of growing up, obviously, this season and trying to...
By the way, he's 21 right now.
Yes, I agree. And it's crazy because I've only been around this stuff for, a handful of years. I feel like he's 26 already. I feel like Zarco's 48, but that's a different story. But I also just, when you hear the stories, whether it be from other podcasts or from reading articles and all the rest about Acosta trying to figure out the KTM and worry less about being on VR46 and going to Ducati, just focus on what we have. Like Danny Pedrosa apparently has been telling him, just focus. Just do the damn thing that you've been hired to do. We're all here working towards something. You're the one who has to ride it during the race. You're super talented. Please stop effing around and just focus on what you need to focus on. And apparently he's been pretty good at that this year. And when he's been having podiums and all the rest and doing interviews at the end, he's personable and he's outgoing. He's this and that. He was giving 3-word answers on Tuesday morning when he was asked, "Hey, Pedro, your future?" "Oh, I'm not concerned." And just sitting there quietly doing nothing. And then out of nowhere, it was a bizarre interview. If anybody wants to go find it, Jack Appleyard says, what are you excited to work on in the offseason? And he said, "Well, Paul Trevathan says that I need to start working on more sentences because I don't know how to put together long words, so I need to start saying more things." And he's like, what's the saying? The get the fuck out of Dodge? He just said that and immediately Jack Appleyard's like, "Whoa, okay, yep, it's nice, okay."
Yeah, that provoked a whole discussion of cowboy movies in the media center.
I was like the whole anyways, him being that in the morning, it was such a strange interview. And then not long afterwards, I believe, they cut to Fabio Quartararo and Jack Miller looking at Whoop, which is basically like their, body recovery. How much sleep did you have? What was your REM cycle like? Your nutrition, your hydration, all these things to try and make sure they're good. Quartararo's was at 1%. And I was like, I don't know if 0 means you're dead, but his voice sounded like it. Again, my son was home from school with a little bit of laryngitis. His voice was kind of off. He had some croupy cough. And then Quartararo did an interview and sounded like my 5-year-old. And I was like, how did he get like that? So did you hear anything while you were over there about what post-race Sunday awards gala shenanigans went on or anything? Because it seemed like some of the guys that very much wish they were at Ducati might have been having some crying into a beer about not being with Ducati and Acosta and Quartararo.
Well, I think mostly you're crying into a Red Bull and vodka. It's more the way that goes.
Also, sorry, side note on this. I don't want to cut you off, but I was going to ask you if you could do some real journalism over there, and I forgot to, as to whether or not the Red Bull that the riders are drinking the second that they get on camera at all moments when they actually crack the can, that's just water, right? There's no way.
They all have it. And there has been mix-ups when somebody puts the wrong case in the wrong place and somebody has a swig of warm Red Bull right after a race. But Monster have actually acknowledged that there is water in cans that look like it's Monster. Red Bull probably haven't. And Red Bull have cola and some other stuff too, right? The original Red Bull was a cola. But yeah, they're you can't blame the sugar water guys for being touchy about that, because most of us don't really want to drink something sweet when we've been exercising.
Yeah, I was just thinking what
Plus,
bad.
your mouth is just glued shut, right?
Totally. Like, what bad negative reverse marketing would that be if somebody cracks it because they're supposed to contractually? They take a sip and they're like, "Oh my God, this is terrible. What is this?" Like, the natural visceral reaction of having the wrong can would be just absolutely terrible for them. But
Marshall, we're never going to get an energy drink sponsor if you keep this up.
I'm all for trying to maximize all the markets. I'm just saying that was one of those things where, again, my son watching the MotoGP stuff with me, he asked me the other day, Dad, they're not actually drinking Red Bull that much, are they? He's like, every time that they're after the race, they just grab a Red Bull right away. I was like, I'm pretty sure that's water, buddy. I'll have to ask Colin. So yeah, I should have asked you to go and hack apart some of the different cans and do some taste tests and all the rest.
Well, I know from a few years ago with Jonathan Ray, who was Red Bull and it switched to Monster, because it was a discussion about when things get mixed up and you're trying to make sure that the right cans are in the right place. So, the team guys can have the real stuff and the racer who just got off the bike can drink the alternate.
Amazing, interesting stuff. Is there anything else that jumped out to you? Actually, you know what? Let's dive into the actual reason that you were over there, aside from shooting pictures of MotoGP stuff, because I did watch the final race in the 160cc class, and it was great to see a Canadian on the grid.
Well, it was great that he qualified. He went straight through. So he was, arguably good, but not great. But that was almost ideal in terms of being able to take your spot in the race. And I would say he raced well, but being a little further down the grid is never easy. And it was impressively competitive. Reardon had just turned 11, so he's arguably has 3 more years of eligibility, and his family is living in Spain to try and help forward his career. And he's run the national series there, but he also runs a regional, which is intriguingly, although the spec tire for MiniGP is Pirelli, the regional series in Spain runs on Dunlops. So the weekend before, so 4 days before he raced in Valencia, he was racing at a go-kart track in a regional event on Dunlops, qualified sixth, finished third. And that's a gamble because he could have got hurt. And some of the riders who were there were injured from other races. And Jaeger Stockill was hurt from trying a bigger displacement motorcycle while he was testing. Almost everybody was in Spain trying to be as ready as they could be, because most of these series had wrapped up a couple of months ago. So the guys hadn't had a lot of seat time. So Reardon gambled and he tested and he raced. He was in good shape. And I think between his relatively small size and lightweight, and the fact that he had raced recently, that those were the important steps for him. And it is an interesting situation. Arguably Reardon raced in Canada because it was going to be easier to qualify in Canada. Like, technically he could qualify through Spain, but it's very, very hard because it's so competitive there. And when you look at where the guys are born versus what team they were riding for, there were a number of people riding for countries that aren't their countries of birth, because you can choose, okay, I'm going to, Czechoslovakian, but I'm going to ride in Germany or France or whatever. So it's a pretty global thing, but it still gravitates heavily towards Italy and particularly Spain.
You showed your age with Czechoslovakia there, Colin. Oh my God.
Czech Republic.
That was 3 countries ago. I've told you. I've told you the story. I always remember the World Junior one of the Czech Republic and Slovakia become their own separate entities in the middle of the night, and the World Juniors, the Czechoslovakian team, gets woken up and they're like, "Hey, you guys aren't a country anymore." What? It's like it's just bad timing. But the one for me was, I don't think I've ever mentioned it on this podcast. CFL and TSN, they gave me a promo read for a hockey game, some tournament somewhere internationally, and it said Czechia takes on Canada tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 Pacific. And I actually pressed the talkback button to our producer. I'm like, "Hey, what's Czechia?" Because I didn't know any news. So I was like, are you guys pranking me right now? I'm not going to go on national television and say Czechia if it's not a country. So I'm Googling 10 seconds before we came back on air the word Czechia. And it's like, yeah, No, it's a country. All right, let's do this thing, right? So, how do you explain the Polish sensations though? Like, is that all of a sudden in a bit of a growth market when it comes to the Moto Mini GP stuff? Because I think anybody who was watching that, like I was, you're expecting it to be Spain, Italy, maybe Portugal, right? You have the odd country mixed in between, but like the two Polish kids that were at the top of the 160, that they were unbelievable.
Well, first of all, until you get them all together, you have no idea, right? That you start looking at the times. Okay, Reardon's about in the middle, and he kept performing that way as we marched through the sessions. So okay, we can certainly get Reardon in, and we'll see how Stockhill does. And arguably Stockhill might be the slightly better racer, but his size and his weight definitely wasn't helping, particularly at that track because it was a stop and go tight track. And I think Stockhill said it would have been nicer to be at the track from last year, particularly if it had rained, because he's comfortable with the rain. And when we were at Tremblant a couple of months ago, he was really impressive on a slippery track there. But you can't count on it raining all the time. And this is, I don't know how many times I've been in Valencia this time of year, quite a number of times, and it rained one night. It
Wow.
hardly rained at all. So
Wasn't that the
it's
Monday
about
night
as
when they said the thunderstorms rolled through and ruined the morning of testing? Yeah.
yeah, and I think that that was overplayed a bit because they're always worried about how short the day is there, and they did get started late. But I was impressed that most of the guys just rode and rode and rode. Like there wasn't much time for sitting and drinking water, right? There was, the engineers have a list of things we're trying to work through, and the top guys respect that this is one of the few times they get to ride the bike without all the normal rules and restrictions, and that's in some cases there's the development team. I haven't seen those guys more than twice this year, and particularly with the people who are using new technology like Yamaha, I can't imagine how many people must have come to run all of those bikes. And I was looking at there's a tunnel where they store the overflow of the shipping cases. And I was looking at the HRC cases, and one of them said, and these are stuff that came in to be used for Tuesday. It was case whatever of 51 cases of stuff that had
Wow.
come in for the test. And I've heard stories about Honda having to rent places to keep everything because, just trying to keep track of all the different body work and, the sequence you're going to run it. And we saw mix and match, right? This tail section with that front fairing with last year's and all that kind of stuff, and keeping track of that. It's not like F1 where you're very, very restricted. This is an open test, right? They could do what they wanted to do. And you saw it or heard it more accurately, particularly early on when the bikes weren't together much, that the engines sounded different because they weren't in any kind of economy mode. And the story goes that some of the bikes were actually running full power, and normally they wouldn't at that track. Like probably most of the times the bikes have around 240 horsepower at that venue, but the bikes can make very close to 300, and some of them apparently were doing that.
What was your favorite corner to shoot while you were there?
Well, there's a place in the middle where it's kind of like shooting a motocross. You can just keep looking, and there's more corners, so that's fun
That's
because you
like
get multiple.
Portimao, right? Like 7/8. It's like I like turn this way. No, I would turn this way. No.
Yeah, but Portimao's bigger, so it's not as good for that. But Valencia is one of the best places, modern racetracks, to take pictures because the fans are all on the outside, the services are all on the inside. So there isn't, other than team managers on their scooters pulling up beside you when you're trying to work, and I'm sure they think I'm annoying because he's trying to work too. But you get a lot of comments about it's one of the few events, that Tuesday test, when team guys get to go out and watch their riders ride, and certainly whether it's Pedro Acosta or Quadraro, there's a couple of guys who do stand out as having a lot of commitment all the time. And the pace and the standard of riding and the dedication is sky high, right? The guys at the back, the guys who've never ridden a MotoGP bike until Tuesday, they all look good. There's nobody riding around looking like they don't have a motivation. So it's nonstop people riding flat out.
Celestina Vietti already better than some Cat Chantra? Huh? Maybe. See. We'll see.
Yeah,
We'll
but
see.
then the argument is land on your head a couple of times and see how motivated you are.
Well, Iagura's gone through that this year, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly the Trackhouse
And
story.
and by the way, I was very impressed by him. Just pick someone out of a clear blue sky.
Yeah.
Very impressed.
Well, and I know that we don't really care about, testing best time, but it's like we haven't said the name Raul Fernandez once. The whole time we've been talking about this, right? Because there's a billion different stories, and it's like, but he was the fastest at the test. We should give him credit for that.
Well, I mean, we seem to have established that Aprilia is the second best bike, and I bet Aprilia would not appreciate me viewing it that way.
Yeah.
But I still believe Marc Marquez on a Ducati is the high water mark. So we just have to hope that Ducati saw the data that this is going to fit with what the struggles were that Marc has, because the story is Marc could ride around his problems and Pecco can't. And there's no question that Pecco is a detuned guy, and it's sad to see because his potential level is Marquez high, but definitely we've seen a situation where Quadraro is now, for whatever reason, 2 years into a big money deal, being recognized as one of the top guns and somebody who, if you're trying to make a step up the grid, he might be the guy you gamble on.
Yeah, and one of the more marketable people as well. Can you imagine a Quadraro Marquez like Lenovo factory Ducati team in terms of the marketability of that and the fan bases?
Oh, I think there's some people in Italy who are imagining that directly.
Yeah, I would imagine. By the way, we're going to close this thing out in a couple of minutes, but my Mount Rushmore, my top four favorite visuals as of late. I'm just going to mix this in. Charles Leclerc doing that sunset lap at Coda, put to the what was the music? Not Mission Impossible. I'm trying to think. Oh my God, the other Tom Cruise movie off the top of my Top Gun. The Max Verstappen lap at Brazil at Interlagos when it was pitch black, like the storm clouds and all the rest of him racing around. Those are my two of my four favorite visuals. The third one is any of our CSBK guys racing towards the canola fields at Rad Torque with clouds coming in, rolling off in the distance. And the last one is full credit to everybody at Dorna being able to time out the sunset to the end of the session, because the visuals of the bikes ripping around and the sunset glistening off of all of the helmets at the end of the 6-hour broadcast, phenomenal. In terms of like marketable images, you probably have some great shots at the end of the day from that stuff.
Well, it's funny because normally the bikes are never out in the golden hour, right?
Yeah.
That light is only for flat track or test sessions. And when we all did the math after the delays and went, it's fall, it's getting dark early, we are going to be able to shoot in that light. And I went down to turn one and shot on the inside, and was very, very happy because I have never shot MotoGP in that light ever. And just for instance, in flat tracks, they usually restart the qualifying at 7 o'clock, and in the summer you're just getting into golden light. So I always know those first pro sessions right after the rider intro is a great time to shoot a flat track, and they give us the golden light almost every national.
That's amazing. I'm going to round this thing out because we started with Honda by showing, usually I give Colin a Hot Wheel or something fun. Today, I picked up one for myself. Santa delivered early, a 1973 Honda Civic Custom with a number 2 Motul and Bridgestone on this bad boy as well. So that's my present to me this holiday season. But Colin,
not for Ben?
No. You know what? Maybe there's one in the mail. We'll see if I can get Ben's mailing address once again. But that's going to do it for us. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Colin, thank you for the insight from Valencia. It was great to chat with you, and we'll catch up with you soon.